Prince Alexander sat by his bedroom window on the third floor of the Grand Palace. He was 12 years old, but he was not like other children his age. While most kids his age played video games or watched cartoons, Alexander spent his time watching people. He found people much more interesting than any game or movie. The palace was huge. It had over 200 rooms, and Alexander had explored most of them. But his favorite place was still his bedroom window. From there, he could see the main courtyard, the gardens and the gates where the guards stood all day and all night. Alexander had been watching the guards for 3 years now. He knew all their names, their habits, and even their favorite snacks. Every day at 3 in the afternoon, Alexander would finish his lessons with Professor Hartwell. The professor was an old man with gray hair and thick glasses. He taught Alexander about history, languages, and how to be a good ruler one day. But the most important lesson Professor Hartwell ever taught him was about watching and learning. A good king must see everything, Professor Hartwell had told him many times. You must watch how people act. You must notice things others miss. Your eyes and your brain are your best tools. Alexander took this advice very seriously. He had notebooks full of observations about the palace staff. He knew that Mrs. Jenkins in the kitchen always hummed when she was happy. He knew that the gardener, Mr. Thompson, walked differently when his back was hurting. He knew that Captain Morrison, the head of security, always touched his badge when he was worried about something. The guards were Alexander's favorite people to watch. They stood so straight and still, but each one was different. Some guards looked around a lot. Others kept their eyes fixed on one spot. Some held their rifles tight, others held them loose. Alexander had learned to read these small differences. On this Tuesday afternoon in October, Alexander sat in his usual spot by the window. The weather was cool, and the leaves on the trees were turning orange and red. It was a beautiful day, and many tourists were walking around the palace grounds taking pictures. Alexander liked watching the tourists too. They always looked so excited to be there. But today, Alexander was not watching the tourists. He was looking at the new guard, at the East Gate. The man had started working there just 1 week ago. His name was Thomas Whitfield, and Captain Morrison had introduced him to all the other guards during the morning briefing. Alexander had watched that meeting from his window. Thomas Whitfield looked like a perfect guard. He was tall and strong. His uniform was clean and neat. His boots were shiny. His hair was cut short like a soldier's hair. When he walked like a military man. When he saluted, his salute was perfect. Everything about him seemed right. But something felt wrong to Alexander. Alexander could not explain exactly what bothered him about Thomas Whitfield. It was just a feeling. Professor Hartwell had taught him to trust his feelings when he was observing people. Your brain sees things your conscious mind does not notice yet, the professor had explained. If something feels wrong, pay attention. Look closer. So Alexander looked closer at Thomas Whitfield. The new guard stood at the East Gate like he was supposed to. He checked the identification of visitors like he was supposed to. He spoke politely to tourists who asked questions. He followed all the rules perfectly. Too perfectly, Alexander thought. Alexander had watched many new guards over the years. Most new guards were nervous for their first few weeks. They would look around too much, trying to see everything. They would hold their rifles too tight because they were scared of dropping them. They would ask the other guards questions about what to do. But Thomas Whitfield was not nervous at all. He acted like he had been working at the palace for years. He never asked questions. He never looked confused. He seemed to know exactly where everything was and exactly what to do. This was the first thing that bothered Alexander. The second thing was smaller, but Alexander noticed it anyway. When Thomas Whitfield was not checking visitors or talking to tourists, his eyes moved in a pattern. Most guards just looked around randomly. But Thomas Whitfield's eyes moved from the main building to the side buildings, to the gardens, to the parking area, and then back to the main building. He did this same pattern over and over again. It was like he was following a map in his head. Alexander took out one of his notebooks and started writing down what he saw. He wrote down the time when Thomas Whitfield started his pattern. He drew a picture of the guard's path of looking. He wrote down how long it took Thomas Whitfield to complete one full pattern. Professor Hartwell had taught Alexander to always write down his observations. "Memory is not perfect," the professor said. "Write down what you see when you see it. Later you can look for patterns and connections." As Alexander watched and wrote, he noticed something else. Thomas Whitfield wore his watch on his right wrist. This might seem like a small thing, but Alexander knew it was important. Most people wear their watch on their non-dominant hand. If you are right-handed, you wear your watch on your left wrist. This makes it easier to look at the time and to wind the watch if it needs winding. Alexander watched Thomas Whitfield carefully. When the guard wrote something on his clipboard, he used his right hand. When he opened doors for visitors, he used his right hand. When he saluted, he used his right hand. Thomas Whitfield was definitely right-handed. So why did he wear his watch on his right wrist? Alexander had learned about this in one of his security briefings. His father, King Frederick, believed that Alexander should learn about palace security from a young age. Once a month, Captain Morrison would teach Alexander about how the palace was protected. In one of these lessons, Captain Morrison had explained that trained spies and soldiers sometimes did things differently on purpose. They might wear their watch on the wrong wrist to confuse people who were watching them. They might write with their left hand even if they were right-handed. They might walk differently than normal. These small changes could help hide their true identity. At the time, Alexander had thought this was just an interesting fact. Now, watching Thomas Whitfield, he wondered if it meant something more. Alexander spent the rest of the afternoon watching the new guard. He filled up 4 pages in his notebook with observations. Thomas Whitfield did his job perfectly, but everything about him felt planned and practiced. There were no mistakes, no casual moments, no times when he seemed to relax and just be himself. When the sun started to set, Alexander's mother called him for dinner. Queen Isabella always insisted that the family eat dinner together when possible. As Alexander put away his notebook and left his room, he was still thinking about Thomas Whitfield. Something was definitely not right about the new guard. Alexander just had to figure out what it was. The next morning, Alexander woke up early. He had been thinking about Thomas Whitfield all night, and he wanted to watch the guard more carefully. Alexander got dressed quickly and ate his breakfast fast. By 7:30, he was back at his window, with his notebook and a pair of binoculars. Thomas Whitfield was already at his post at the east gate. Alexander wondered what time the guard had arrived for work. Most guards started their shifts at 8 o'clock, but Thomas was already there and looked like he had been working for a while. Alexander opened his notebook to a fresh page and started writing down everything he saw. He wrote down the time, the weather, and what Thomas Whitfield was doing. The guard was checking the identification cards of palace workers who were arriving for their morning shifts. Alexander watched Thomas check the cards of people he knew well. There was Mrs. Jenkins from the kitchen, Mr. Peterson from maintenance, and Miss Rodriguez from the gift shop. These people had worked at the palace for years. The regular guards knew them by sight, and usually just waved them through with a smile and a good morning greeting. But Thomas Whitfield checked every single identification card carefully. He looked at the photo, then at the person's face, then back at the photo. He examined the card itself, turning it over to look at both sides. He even used a small magnifying glass to look at details on the cards. This seemed very careful and professional. Maybe too careful, Alexander thought. Why would a guard need to examine the identification cards of people who worked at the palace every day? And where did Thomas get that magnifying glass? Alexander had never seen any other guard use one. Alexander wrote down all these questions in his notebook. Professor Hartwell had taught him that questions were just as important as observations. A question today might become an answer tomorrow, the professor always said. As the morning went on, Alexander noticed more strange things about Thomas Whitfield. When there were no visitors to check, most guards would talk to each other or stand quietly. But Thomas never seemed to rest. His eyes were always moving, always looking at something. Alexander used his binoculars to see exactly where Thomas was, looking. The guard's eyes moved to the main palace building, then to the security cameras, then to the other guard posts, then to the parking areas. But he was not just looking around randomly. He seemed to be studying everything very carefully. At 9:15, a group of tourists arrived for the morning tour. Alexander watched Thomas check their tickets and identification. The guard was polite and helpful, but Alexander noticed something odd. While Thomas was talking to the tourists and smiling, his eyes kept moving to look at other things. He would glance at the palace windows, then at the other guards, then at the security cameras. It was like Thomas was doing two jobs at the same time. He was being a good guard and helping the visitors, but he was also doing something else. Something secret. Alexander decided to test his theory. He moved away from his bedroom window and went to a window in the library on the second floor. From there, he could see a different part of the palace grounds. He wanted to see if Thomas would look at this area too. Sure enough, when Alexander looked through the library window, he could see Thomas Whitfield looking in his direction. The guard's eyes moved to the library windows, then to the windows of other rooms on the second floor, then to the third floor where Alexander's bedroom was located. Thomas Whitfield was not just watching the east gate. He was studying the entire palace. Alexander went back to his bedroom and wrote down this new information. He also drew a map showing all the areas that Thomas looked at during his surveillance pattern. When Alexander finished his drawing, he realized something scary. Thomas Whitfield was looking at all the most important parts of the palace security system. The guard was studying the camera locations, the positions of other guards, the main entrances and exits, and the windows of important rooms. He was creating a mental map of how the palace was protected. But why would a guard need to do this? Guards were trained about palace security during their first week of work. Captain Morrison gave all new guards a complete tour and explained how everything worked. There was no reason for Thomas to be figuring out these things on his own, unless he was not really a guard at all. This thought made Alexander's heart beat faster. Could Thomas Whitfield be a spy? Could he be someone dangerous who was pretending to be a guard? Alexander knew he needed more evidence before he could tell anyone about his suspicions. Adults did not always believe children, even when the child was a prince. Alexander needed to be very sure about what he was seeing. He decided to learn more about Thomas Whitfield's background. Alexander had access to the palace computer system for his school research. Maybe he could find information about the new guard. Alexander went to his computer and logged into the palace staff directory. He found Thomas Whitfield's file and opened it. According to the file, Thomas was 28 years old. He had served in the army for 6 years. He had worked as a security guard at 2 other important buildings before coming to the palace. His references were excellent. His background check had found no problems. Everything in the file looked perfect. Too perfect, Alexander thought. Real. People usually had some small problems in their background. Maybe they had changed jobs several times, or maybe they had gotten in trouble for something minor. But Thomas Whitfield's record showed no mistakes, no problems, and no gaps in his employment history. Alexander printed out the file and studied it more carefully. He noticed that all of Thomas's previous jobs had been at government buildings or important private companies. These were exactly the kind of places where someone could learn about security systems and procedures. Alexander also noticed that Thomas had excellent recommendations from his previous employers. But all the recommendation letters were written in very similar language. They all used the same phrases to describe Thomas's work. They all mentioned the same good qualities. It was almost like the same person had written all the letters. Alexander had read many recommendation letters during his studies of government and business. Real letters were usually different from each other. Each person wrote in their own style and focused on different aspects of someone's work. But Thomas Whitfield's recommendation letters were too similar to be real. Alexander was now sure that something was very wrong with Thomas Whitfield. The guard was either not who he claimed to be, or he was working for someone other than the palace security department. Alexander decided to watch Thomas more carefully over the next few days. He would document everything the guard did and try to find more evidence of suspicious behavior. Then he would have enough proof to take to Captain Morrison or to his father. But Alexander also knew he had to be very careful. If Thomas Whitfield really was a spy or a criminal, then he might be dangerous. Alexander could not let Thomas know that he was being watched and studied. Alexander spent the rest of the day making a plan. He would watch Thomas from different windows at different times. He would take photos with his camera when possible. He would write down everything in detail, and he would try to figure out what Thomas was really trying to do at the palace. As Alexander closed his notebook that evening, he felt excited and scared at the same time. He might have discovered something very important, something that could protect his family and everyone who worked at the palace. But he also knew that he was just a 12-year-old boy, and Thomas Whitfield was a grown man who might be very dangerous. Alexander would have to be smarter and more careful than he had ever been before. On Thursday morning, Alexander decided to change his watching routine. Instead of staying in his room all day, he would move around the palace and observe Thomas Whitfield from different locations. This would give him a better view of what the guard was really doing. Alexander started his day in the palace library. The library had tall windows that looked out over the courtyard and the east gate. From there, Alexander could see Thomas Whitfield clearly, but the guard would not notice him watching. The library was on the second floor, and the windows had curtains that Alexander could hide behind. Alexander brought his notebook, his binoculars, and his camera. He also brought some school books so that if anyone asked what he was doing, he could say he was studying. Professor Hartwell had taught him that the best way to watch people without being noticed was to look busy doing something else. At 10 o'clock in the morning, something interesting happened. A maintenance worker named Carlos was walking across the courtyard carrying a large folder full of papers. Carlos worked on the palace heating and cooling systems, and he often carried blueprints and technical drawings with him. As Carlos walked past the east gate, he tripped on a loose stone in the pathway. The folder flew out of his hands, and papers scattered everywhere across the ground. Carlos looked upset and started gathering up the papers as quickly as he could. Thomas Whitfield immediately left his post to help Carlos collect the papers. This seemed like a kind and helpful thing to do. But Alexander noticed something strange about the way Thomas was helping. Most people who are helping someone pick up scattered papers will just grab whatever papers are closest and hand them back. But Thomas Whitfield was being very selective about which papers he picked up. He was choosing the papers that had drawings and diagrams on them. And instead of immediately handing them back to Carlos, Thomas was looking at them carefully. Alexander used his binoculars to get a closer look. He could see that the papers Thomas was examining were architectural drawings of the palace. These drawings showed the layouts of different floors, the locations of electrical systems, and the positions of heating and cooling equipment. Thomas spent almost 30 seconds looking at each drawing before giving it back to Carlos. 30 seconds might not seem like a long time, but it was long enough for someone with a good memory to memorize important details from a technical drawing. Alexander took several photos of Thomas looking at the papers. The photos were taken from far away, so they were not perfectly clear, but they showed Thomas holding the drawings and studying them instead of immediately returning them to Carlos. After all the papers were collected, Carlos thanked Thomas for his help and continued on his way. Thomas returned to his guard post at the east gate, but Alexander noticed that Thomas looked different now. He seemed excited about something. There was a small smile on his face, and he kept touching his pocket as if he had put something important there. Alexander wrote down everything he had observed. He noted the time, the type of papers Thomas had examined, and how long Thomas had looked at each paper. Alexander also wrote down his theory about what had happened. Thomas Whitfield had used Carlos's accident as an opportunity to study architectural drawings of the palace. But Alexander wanted to be sure about what he had seen. Maybe Thomas was just being helpful and Alexander was imagining things that were not really there. Alexander decided to test his theory by creating a similar situation. Alexander knew that his friend Miguel worked in the palace maintenance department. Miguel was 19 years old and had grown up in the town near the palace. Alexander had known Miguel since they were both small children, and Miguel was one of the few palace workers who treated Alexander like a normal person instead of like a prince. Alexander found Miguel in the basement workshop where the maintenance staff kept their tools and supplies. Alexander explained that he needed Miguel's help with a school project about palace architecture. This was not completely untrue. Alexander was studying architecture as part of his education about managing royal properties. Alexander asked Miguel if he could borrow some old blueprints or drawings that were not secret or important. Miguel found a folder of drawings that showed the palace's original construction from 200 years ago. These drawings were interesting for historical research, but they did not show any current security information. Alexander's plan was simple. He would ask Miguel to walk past the East Gate carrying these historical drawings. Then Alexander would watch to see if Thomas Whitfield showed any interest in looking at them. Miguel agreed to help with the plan. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Miguel walked across the courtyard carrying the folder of historical drawings. As he passed near Thomas Whitfield's guard post, Miguel pretended to receive an important phone call. He stopped walking and set the folder down on a nearby bench while he answered his phone. Alexander watched through his binoculars from the library window. Thomas Whitfield immediately noticed the folder of drawings sitting on the bench. The guard looked around to make sure no one was watching him, then walked over to the bench. Thomas opened the folder and began looking through the drawings inside. But after just a few seconds, he closed the folder and walked away. He looked disappointed, like the drawings had not contained the information he was looking for. This reaction told Alexander something very important. Thomas Whitfield was not just curious about palace architecture in general. He was looking for specific types of information. When he saw that Miguel's folder contained only old historical drawings, he lost interest immediately. But when Carlos had dropped his folder of current technical drawings, Thomas had been very interested. This meant that Thomas wanted to see recent information about the palace's systems and layout, not old historical information. Alexander was now certain that Thomas Whitfield was gathering intelligence about the palace. But Alexander still did not know why Thomas was doing this or who he was working for. Alexander decided to try a different approach. Instead of just watching Thomas from far away, Alexander would try to get closer and listen to what Thomas was saying. Maybe Thomas would make phone calls or talk to other people in ways that would reveal his true purpose. Alexander knew this would be more dangerous than watching from his room or the library. If Thomas really was a spy or a criminal, then getting close to him could put Alexander in danger. But Alexander felt that he needed to learn more in order to protect his family and the palace. Alexander planned his approach carefully. He would pretend to be taking a casual walk around the palace grounds. Many people took walks in the palace gardens, so this would not seem unusual. Alexander would bring a book to read and find a bench near the East Gate where he could sit and listen. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Alexander put his plan into action. He walked out of the palace through the main entrance and into the gardens. He found a bench about 50 feet away from the East Gate where Thomas Whitfield was standing. The bench was partially hidden by some large bushes, so Alexander could sit there without being too obvious. Alexander opened his book and pretended to read while actually listening carefully to everything happening around the East Gate. For the first 20 minutes, nothing interesting happened. Thomas checked the identification of a few visitors and gave directions to some tourists. But at 4:25, Thomas's cell phone rang. Alexander heard Thomas answer the phone and begin speaking in a quiet voice. Alexander could not hear everything Thomas was saying, but he caught a few important words and phrases. Thomas said something about the heating systems and access points. He mentioned next week and the state dinner. He also said something about photographs and sending the information tonight. Alexander's heart started beating very fast. The state dinner that Thomas had mentioned was a very important event, happening the following week. The king and queen of a neighboring country would be visiting, and there would be a formal dinner with many important guests. Palace security was always increased during state dinners because so many important people would be in the building at the same time. If Thomas Whitfield was planning something bad for the state dinner, then Alexander had to act quickly. There was only 1 week left to stop whatever Thomas was planning. Alexander listened for a few more minutes, but Thomas finished his phone call and went back to his normal guard duties. Alexander returned to his room and wrote down everything he had heard. He also started making a plan for what to do next. Alexander knew that he could not wait much longer to tell someone about his suspicions. If Thomas was planning something for the state dinner, Then Captain Morrison and the other security staff needed to know about it as soon as possible. But Alexander also knew that he needed to be very careful about how he shared this information. Adults might not believe a 12-year-old boy's theories about a guard being a spy. Alexander needed to present his evidence in a way that would convince the adults to take action. Alexander spent the evening organizing all his notes and photos. He created a timeline of Thomas Whitfield's suspicious behaviors. He wrote down all his observations and theories. And he began planning how to alert the palace security team without putting himself in danger. Alexander knew that tomorrow would be a very important day. Friday morning came quickly, and Alexander woke up feeling nervous and excited at the same time. Today he would have to find a way to warn Captain Morrison about Thomas Whitfield without creating a big scene or putting himself in danger. Alexander had thought about several different ways to share his information. He could write a letter to Captain Morrison and leave it on his desk. He could ask to speak privately with his father, King Frederick. He could even call the palace security office and report his suspicions over the phone. But all of these approaches had problems. A letter might not be taken seriously, especially if it came from a 12-year-old prince. A private meeting with his father would be hard to arrange quickly, and it might seem strange to other people. A phone call could be overheard by the wrong person. Alexander needed a way to communicate that was immediate, private, and would definitely get the right person's attention. As he was thinking about this problem, Alexander remembered something his father had taught him during one of their security lessons. King Frederick had explained that in dangerous situations, sometimes people could not speak openly about threats or problems. They might be in a room with enemies, or they might be in a place where conversations could be overheard. In these situations, trained security personnel used hand signals to communicate important information silently. Alexander's father had taught him several of these hand signals. There were signals that meant danger, all clear, need help, and suspicious person. The signals looked like normal gestures that anyone might make, but to someone who knew the code, they carried important messages. The signal for suspicious person requiring immediate but discreet investigation was specific, but not too obvious. The person making the signal would touch their left shoulder twice with their right hand, then adjust their collar with the same hand. To most people, this would look like someone fixing their clothing. But to a trained security officer, it would be a clear message. Alexander had practiced these signals many times during his lessons with his father, but he had never used them in a real situation. Today would be the first time he would use them to communicate actual danger. Alexander's plan was to position himself where Captain Morrison could see him during the evening guard change. Every day at 6 o'clock, Captain Morrison walked around the palace grounds to check on all the guard posts and make sure the night shift was ready to begin their duties. This walk always included a stop at the east gate where Thomas Whitfield was stationed. Alexander would find a reason to be outside during Captain Morrison's walk. When the captain was looking in his direction, Alexander would make the hand signal for suspicious person. Then Captain Morrison would know to pay special attention to Alexander's concerns. This plan was good because it was private. Only Captain Morrison would understand what the signal meant. It was also immediate. Captain Morrison would get the EI message right away. And it would definitely get the captain's attention because the hand signals were only used in serious situations. But Alexander knew he had to be very careful about the timing and location of his signal. He could not make the signal when Thomas Whitfield or other guards might see him. He also had to make sure that Captain Morrison was looking in the right direction at the right time. Alexander spent the day preparing for his signal. He studied Captain Morrison's usual route around the palace grounds. He identified the best location to position himself where the captain would see him, but Thomas Whitfield would not. He practiced the hand signal several times to make sure he could do it smoothly and naturally. Alexander also continued watching Thomas Whitfield throughout the day. The guard's behavior was becoming more suspicious every day. Alexander saw Thomas taking photos of different parts of the palace with his cell phone. The photos looked casual, like tourist pictures, but Alexander noticed that Thomas was photographing specific things: security cameras, door locks, window positions, and electrical panels. Alexander also noticed that Thomas was asking questions of other palace workers. When the gardener walked by, Thomas asked about the schedule for lawn maintenance. When a cleaning lady passed the gate, Thomas asked about which rooms she cleaned and when. When a delivery truck arrived, Thomas asked detailed questions about delivery procedures and schedules. All of these questions seemed innocent by themselves. A guard might need to know about palace operations in order to do his job properly. But Alexander saw a pattern in the questions. Thomas was gathering information about when different areas of the palace would be empty or when security might be reduced. By 5:30 in the afternoon, Alexander was ready to put his plan into action. He went to his room and changed into casual clothes that would be appropriate for a walk outside. He brought a book with him, so that he would have a reason to be sitting outside near the gardens. Alexander walked out of the palace through a side entrance that would take him near the east gate, but not directly past Thomas Whitfield's position. He found a bench in the garden area where Captain Morrison would be able to see him during his evening rounds. At exactly 6 o'clock, Alexander saw Captain Morrison begin his walk around the palace grounds. The captain was following his usual route, checking each guard post and talking briefly with each guard on duty. Alexander opened his book and pretended to read while actually watching Captain Morrison's progress. Captain Morrison checked the north gate first, then the west gate, then the main entrance. Alexander knew that the east gate would be next, and that Captain Morrison would be walking in his direction within the next few minutes. Alexander felt his heart beating faster as he waited. He practiced the hand signal one more time under his book where no one could see him. Touch left shoulder twice, then adjust collar. Touch left shoulder twice, then adjust collar. At 6:15, Captain Morrison appeared on the pathway leading to the east gate. He was walking at his usual steady pace, looking professional and alert. As he approached the area where Alexander was sitting, the captain's eyes scanned the gardens and the surrounding areas. This was part of his security training. Always be aware of what was happening around you. When Captain Morrison's eyes moved in Alexander's direction, Alexander knew this was his moment. He closed his book and stood up from the bench as if he was getting ready to go back inside the palace. As he stood, Alexander made the hand signal clearly and deliberately. Touch left shoulder twice with the right hand. Adjust collar with the same hand. Alexander saw Captain Morrison's eyes focus on him immediately. The captain's expression changed slightly. Not enough for other people to notice, but enough for Alexander to see that the message had been received and understood. Captain Morrison continued his walk toward the east gate as if nothing had happened. He spoke with Thomas Whitfield for a few minutes, checking on the guard's duties and asking about any incidents during the day. To anyone watching, this looked like a normal conversation between a captain and one of his guards. But Alexander noticed that Captain Morrison was observing Thomas Whitfield more carefully than usual. The captain's eyes studied the guard's face, his posture, and his responses to questions. Captain Morrison was conducting a subtle evaluation of Thomas Whitfield based on Alexander's warning signal. After finishing his conversation with Thomas, Captain Morrison continued his rounds to the remaining guard posts. When he was finished, he walked back toward the main palace building. As he passed near the garden where Alexander was still standing, Captain Morrison made a small hand signal in return. The signal Captain Morrison made meant, "Message received and understood." Alexander felt a huge sense of relief. His warning had been successfully communicated, and Captain Morrison would now begin investigating Thomas Whitfield properly. Alexander returned to his room feeling proud of himself for successfully using the communication skills his father had taught him. But he also felt nervous about what would happen next. If Thomas Whitfield really was a spy or a criminal, then the next few days would be very dangerous for everyone at the palace. Alexander knew that his part in the investigation was not finished. Captain Morrison would need time to gather evidence and plan a response to the threat that Thomas Whitfield might represent. During this time, Alexander would continue watching and documenting everything he saw. Alexander also knew that he had to be even more careful now. If Thomas Whitfield suspected that someone was watching him or investigating him, he might become desperate and do something dangerous immediately. Alexander could not let Thomas know that his cover had been blown. As Alexander sat at his desk writing in his notebook that evening, He felt like he had taken the first important step in protecting his family and his home. The secret signal had been sent and received. Now the real work of stopping Thomas Whitfield would begin. Alexander went to sleep that night knowing that he had done the right thing, but also knowing that the most dangerous part of this situation was still ahead of them. Captain Morrison did not sleep well that Friday night. He had been working in palace security for 20 years, and he had learned to trust his instincts about danger. When Prince Alexander had given him the hand signal for a suspicious person, every alarm bell in Morrison's mind had started ringing. Morrison knew that Alexander was not an ordinary 12-year-old boy. The young prince had been receiving security training since he was 8 years old. Alexander understood how to observe people and situations in ways that most adults never learned. If Alexander thought there was something suspicious about one of the guards, Morrison knew he had to take that warning very seriously. But Morrison also knew he had to be very careful about how he investigated Thomas Whitfield. If Whitfield really was a threat, then investigating him too obviously might cause him to panic and do something dangerous immediately. Morrison needed to gather information about Whitfield without letting the guard know he was being investigated. Early Saturday morning, Morrison went to his office and began reviewing Thomas Whitfield's employment file. Morrison had approved Whitfield's hiring just 2 weeks ago, but now he wanted to examine every detail of the man's background much more carefully. On the surface, everything about Whitfield's file looked perfect. His military service record showed 6 years of excellent performance. His previous security jobs had all been at important government buildings or large corporations. His supervisors had given him outstanding recommendations. His background check had found no criminal history, no financial problems, and no connections to dangerous organizations. But Morrison had investigated many cases over the years, and he knew that when something looked too perfect, it was often because someone had worked very hard to make it look that way. Morrison decided to verify Whitfield's background using resources that had not been available during the initial hiring process. He contacted his friends in military records, government security agencies, and private investigation companies. He asked them to do deep background checks on Thomas Whitfield using their most advanced databases and investigation techniques. Morrison also decided to begin surveillance of Whitfield without the guard's knowledge. Morrison assigned 2 of his most experienced plainclothes security officers to watch Whitfield during his off-duty hours. These officers would follow Whitfield when he left the palace, observe where he went and who he met with, and document everything he did. The plainclothes officers Morrison chose were Sarah Chen and Marcus Rodriguez. Both had been trained in covert surveillance techniques. They knew how to follow someone without being noticed, how to use hidden cameras and recording devices, and how to gather information without alerting their target. Morrison called Chen and Rodriguez to his office for a private briefing. He explained that he had received credible intelligence about a potential security threat involving one of the guards. He did not mention that the intelligence had come from Prince Alexander. Morrison knew that some people might not take a child's observations seriously, even if the child was a prince. Morrison gave Chen and Rodriguez photos of Thomas Whitfield and detailed information about his schedule. Whitfield worked at the palace from 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening, Monday through Friday. After work, he went to an apartment he was renting in the town near the palace. Morrison wanted Chen and Rodriguez to find out everything about Whitfield's activities during his free time. Morrison also made changes to the palace security procedures without making those changes obvious to Whitfield or anyone else who might be working with him. Morrison increased the number of security guards on duty during each shift. He changed the locations of some security cameras. He modified the patrol routes that guards walked during their rounds. These changes would make it harder for anyone to predict palace security patterns. If someone was planning an attack or infiltration, the changes would force them to gather new information or modify their plans. Morrison also decided to test Thomas Whitfield in subtle ways. He would give Whitfield special assignments and see how the guard responded. Morrison would watch to see if Whitfield seemed too interested in certain types of information, or if he asked questions that went beyond what he needed to know for his job. On Saturday afternoon, Morrison approached Whitfield. During his shift at the East Gate, Morrison told Whitfield that there would be some construction work happening in the palace the following week. Morrison said that Whitfield might need to direct construction workers to different entrances depending on what type of work they were doing. Morrison then showed Whitfield a set of building plans that showed the locations of different entrances and the types of access each entrance provided. Morrison watched carefully to see how Whitfield responded to seeing these plans. Whitfield seemed very interested in the building plans. He studied them much more carefully than Morrison would have expected. Whitfield asked several questions about the construction schedule and about which entrances would be available on different days. He also asked about whether the construction would affect any of the palace's security systems. These questions could have been innocent. A guard might need to know this information to do his job properly. But Morrison noticed that Whitfield seemed particularly interested in information about security systems and about entrances that provided access to the most important parts of the palace. Morrison also noticed that Whitfield appeared to be memorizing details from the building plans rather than just getting the information he needed for his immediate duties. Whitfield spent a long time looking at areas of the plans that were not related to the construction work Morrison had described. After the conversation, Morrison felt even more convinced that Alexander's suspicions about Whitfield were correct. But Morrison still needed more evidence before he could take direct action against the guard. Sunday morning, Morrison received the first reports from Chen and Rodriguez about their surveillance of Whitfield. The information they had gathered was very concerning. On Saturday evening, after finishing his shift at the palace, Whitfield had driven to a coffee shop in the town center. At the coffee shop, he had met with a man that Chen and Rodriguez did not recognize. The two men had sat at a corner table and talked quietly for about 30 minutes. Chen and Rodriguez had been able to take photos of the meeting using hidden cameras, but they had not been able to hear the conversation. However, they had seen Whitfield show the other man something on his cell phone. Based on the man's reactions, it appeared that Whitfield was showing him photographs. After the meeting, Whitfield had returned to his apartment, but instead of staying there for the evening, he had left again around 10 o'clock. Chen and Rodriguez had followed him to an internet cafe on the other side of town. At the internet cafe, Whitfield had used one of the public computers for about an hour. Chen and Rodriguez had not been able to see exactly what Whitfield was doing on the computer, but they had observed that he was very careful about making sure no one else could see his screen. The use of a public computer instead of his own personal computer or phone suggested that Whitfield was trying to hide his online activities. People who were doing innocent things usually used their own devices. People who used public computers were often trying to avoid leaving traces of their activities. Morrison also received the results of the deeper background checks he had requested. The results were shocking and confirmed Morrison's worst fears about Thomas Whitfield. The real Thomas Whitfield had died in a car accident 6 months ago. The man who was working as a guard at the palace was using a stolen identity. His real name was Thomas Weatherby, and he had a very different background than what his employment file claimed. Thomas Weatherby had been a military intelligence officer, but he had been dishonorably discharged 3 years ago for selling classified information to foreign agents. After his discharge, Weatherby had disappeared and was believed to be working as a spy for hostile foreign governments. The employment references that had seemed so impressive were all fake. The companies and supervisors who had supposedly recommended Weatherby did not exist. Someone had created an elaborate false identity to get Weatherby hired as a palace guard. Morrison now knew that the palace was facing a serious security threat. Thomas Weatherby was a trained spy who was using a false identity to gather intelligence about the palace. Based on Prince Alexander's observations and the surveillance reports from Chen and Rodriguez, Weatherby was probably planning some kind of attack or infiltration. Morrison knew he had to act quickly, but he also knew he had to be very careful. If Weatherby suspected that his cover had been blown, he might try to carry out his plans immediately, or he might try to escape before he could be captured. Morrison decided to continue the surveillance while he planned the best way to arrest Weatherby. Morrison also decided to increase security around the royal family without making the increased security obvious to Weatherby or anyone else who might be working with him. Morrison was grateful to Prince Alexander for alerting him to this threat. The young prince's observations and his use of the proper communication protocols had probably prevented a serious attack on the palace and the royal family. But Morrison also knew that the most dangerous part of this situation was still ahead. Monday morning brought new developments in the investigation of Thomas Weatherby. Captain Morrison arrived at his office early to review the latest reports from his surveillance team and to coordinate with outside agencies who were helping with the investigation. The deeper background investigation had revealed disturbing details about Thomas Weatherby's real identity and his criminal activities. Morrison learned that Weatherby had not just sold classified information once. He had been involved in espionage activities for several years before being caught and discharged from the military. After his discharge, Weatherby had disappeared, completely. Government agencies had been looking for him for 3 years, but he had successfully hidden his identity and location. During this time, intelligence reports suggested that Weatherby had been working for a foreign intelligence service that was very interested in gathering information about European royal families and government officials. Morrison also learned that the fake identity Weatherby was using, Thomas Whitfield, had been very carefully constructed. The real Thomas Whitfield had been a security guard who had worked at several government buildings. When Whitfield died in the car accident, Weatherby had somehow obtained his personal documents and assumed his identity. Creating a false identity this complete required significant resources and expertise. This meant that Weatherby was not working alone. He was part of a larger espionage operation that had the ability to forge documents, create false employment records, and place operatives in sensitive positions. Morrison realized that the threat to the palace was even more serious than he had initially thought. Weatherby was not just a lone spy trying to gather information. He was part of an organized intelligence operation that might have other operatives in other locations. On Monday afternoon, Morrison received an urgent report from agents Chen and Rodriguez. Their surveillance of Weatherby had uncovered evidence of his espionage activities. On Sunday night, Weatherby had again visited the internet cafe where he had used a public computer. But this time, Chen and Rodriguez had been prepared with better surveillance equipment. They had been able to position a small camera that could see Weatherby's computer screen from a distance. The camera had recorded Weatherby uploading files to an encrypted communication system that was known to be used by foreign intelligence agencies. The files appeared to be photographs and documents related to palace security procedures. Chen and Rodriguez had also followed Weatherby to another meeting with the unknown man from the coffee shop. This time, the meeting had taken place in a parking garage where the two men thought they would not be observed. Chen and Rodriguez had been able to use sensitive listening equipment to record parts of their conversation. In the recorded conversation, Weatherby and the other man had discussed the operation and the timeline. They had mentioned that everything needed to be ready by Thursday, and that the target would be vulnerable during the dinner. Morrison knew immediately what they were talking about. Thursday was the day of the state dinner when the king and queen of the neighboring country would be visiting the palace. This was exactly the event that Prince Alexander had overheard Weatherby mention in his phone conversation. Morrison also learned from the conversation that Weatherby was not planning to act alone during the state dinner. The other man was apparently part of the operation, and there were references to additional assets who would be involved. Morrison now understood the full scope of the threat. Weatherby and his associates were planning some kind of attack or infiltration during the state dinner. They had been gathering detailed information about palace security, building layouts and staff schedules in order to plan their operation. Morrison immediately contacted his superiors in the palace security hierarchy and briefed them on the situation. He also contacted government intelligence agencies who could provide additional resources and expertise for dealing with this threat. The decision was made to arrest Weatherby and his associates as soon as possible before they could carry out their planned operation. But the arrest would have to be carefully coordinated to capture all the members of the spy ring simultaneously. If any of them escaped, they might warn others or try to carry out their plans with reduced resources. Morrison also had to consider the safety of Prince Alexander and the rest of the royal family. If Weatherby suspected that his cover had been blown, he might try to take hostages or launch an immediate attack rather than waiting until Thursday. Morrison decided to increase security around the royal family immediately, but to do it in a way that would not be obvious to Weatherby. Additional guards were assigned to the palace, but they were positioned as maintenance workers, tourists, and other people who would not attract attention. Morrison also decided to modify Weatherby's work schedule in a way that would give the security team more control over his location when the arrest took place. Morrison told Weatherby that he would be working a special assignment on Tuesday that would require him to remain inside the palace building rather than at the East Gate. This assignment would put Weatherby in a location where he could be surrounded and arrested with minimal risk to other people. It would also prevent Weatherby from having easy access to escape routes or to weapons other than his standard guard equipment. Meanwhile, government intelligence agencies were working to identify and locate Weatherby's associates. The man from the coffee shop meetings had been identified through facial recognition technology as Marcus Volkov, a known intelligence operative from the same foreign country that Weatherby was believed to be working for. Volkov was staying at a hotel in the capital city, about 2 hours away from the palace. Surveillance teams were monitoring his activities and preparing to arrest him at the same time that Weatherby was arrested at the palace. Intelligence agencies were also investigating whether there were other members of the spy ring who had not yet been identified. They were analyzing communication records, financial transactions, and travel patterns to look for other people who might be involved in the operation. On Monday evening, Morrison met privately with Prince Alexander to update him on the investigation and to thank him for his crucial role in uncovering the threat. Morrison found Alexander in the palace library, studying for his regular lessons with Professor Hartwell. Morrison was impressed by how calm and mature the young prince appeared, despite the serious situation they were dealing with. Morrison explained to Alexander that his suspicions about Thomas Whitfield had been completely correct. The man was, indeed, a spy using a false identity, and he had been planning an attack during the state dinner. Morrison told Alexander that his careful observations and his proper use of security protocols had prevented what could have been a very dangerous situation. Alexander listened to Morrison's briefing with the same careful attention he gave to his regular lessons. He asked intelligent questions about the investigation and about the security measures being put in place to protect the palace and the royal family. Morrison was struck by Alexander's maturity and his understanding of the seriousness of the situation. The prince did not seem scared or excited by the dramatic events. Instead, he seemed focused on making sure that the threat was handled properly and that everyone would be safe. Alexander also provided Morrison with additional details from his observations that proved to be helpful for planning Weatherby's arrest. Alexander had noticed patterns in Weatherby's behavior that helped Morrison predict how the spy might react when he realized he was being arrested. Morrison left the meeting with Alexander feeling confident that the investigation was proceeding well and that the arrest of Weatherby and his associates would be successful. He was also feeling grateful that the palace had such an observant and responsible young prince who had been able to identify and report this threat before it was too late. But Morrison also knew that the next 24 hours would be the most dangerous part of the entire situation. Arresting trained spies who were armed and desperate would require perfect planning and execution. Any mistake could result in violence or could allow the spies to escape and try again later. Morrison spent Monday night finalizing the arrest plan and coordinating with all the different agencies and personnel who would be involved. Everything had to be ready for Tuesday morning, when the operation to capture Thomas Weatherby and his associates would begin. Tuesday morning arrived with gray clouds and a light rain that made the palace grounds look quiet and peaceful. But Captain Morrison knew that this would be one of the most dangerous days in the palace's recent history. The operation to arrest Thomas Weatherby and his associates was about to begin. Morrison had spent most of the night finalizing the arrest plan with government intelligence agencies and his own security team. Every detail had been carefully planned to minimize the risk of violence and to ensure that all members of the spy ring were captured simultaneously. The plan had several parts that would happen at exactly the same time. At the palace, Morrison would arrest Thomas Weatherby during what appeared to be a routine security meeting. In the capital city, government agents would arrest Marcus Volkov at his hotel. At the internet cafe, other agents would seize the computers that Weatherby had been using to communicate with his handlers. Morrison had also taken precautions to protect the royal family during the arrest. King Frederick, Queen Isabella, and Prince Alexander had been moved to a secure area of the palace where they would be surrounded by additional guards. They had been told that there was a security exercise taking place, so they would not be alarmed by the increased security activity. The arrest of Weatherby would take place in Morrison's office, which was located in the administrative wing of the palace. This area could be isolated from the rest of the palace if necessary, and it provided multiple options for controlling Weatherby's movements. Morrison had also made a crucial decision about Weatherby's weapon. All palace guards carried rifles, but Morrison had secretly replaced the ammunition in Weatherby's rifle with blank cartridges during the previous night's equipment maintenance. If Weatherby tried to use his weapon during the arrest, it would not fire real bullets. This precaution was necessary because Morrison knew that Weatherby was a trained soldier who would likely try to fight his way out when he realized he was being arrested. Morrison wanted to make sure that Weatherby could not hurt anyone even if he managed to get control of his weapon. At 9 o'clock in the morning, Morrison approached Weatherby at the east gate and told him that he needed to attend a special security briefing in Morrison's office. Morrison explained that there would be some changes to security procedures for the upcoming state dinner, and that all guards needed to be updated on the new protocols. This request seemed routine to Weatherby, and he followed Morrison to the administrative building without suspicion. Morrison noticed that Weatherby seemed relaxed and confident, which suggested that he did not suspect that his cover had been blown. As they walked to Morrison's office, Morrison sent a text message to the other teams involved in the operation. The message said simply, "Go," which was the signal for all teams to begin their arrests simultaneously. When Morrison and Weatherby arrived at Morrison's office, Morrison closed the door behind them and activated a security lock that would prevent the door from being opened from the outside. Morrison had positioned 3 additional security officers in the hallway outside his office, in case Weatherby tried to escape. Morrison began the meeting by showing Weatherby some documents that appeared to be new security procedures for the state dinner. As Weatherby leaned forward to examine the documents, Morrison gave a hand signal to agents Chen and Rodriguez, who had been hiding in an adjacent room. Chen and Rodriguez immediately entered Morrison's office through a connecting door. At the same time, Morrison moved to block Weatherby's access to the main door. Weatherby found himself surrounded by 3 security officers with no escape route. For a moment, Weatherby seemed confused about what was happening. Then Morrison spoke clearly and firmly. "Thomas Weatherby, you are under arrest for espionage, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit crimes against the royal family." Weatherby's expression changed immediately from confusion to anger and desperation. He realized that his cover had been completely blown and that he was facing serious criminal charges. Instead of surrendering peacefully, Weatherby decided to fight. Weatherby lunged toward his rifle, which was leaning against the wall near Morrison's desk. Morrison had expected this reaction and was ready for it. Morrison tackled Weatherby before he could reach the weapon, and the 2 men fell to the floor in a struggle. Chen and Rodriguez immediately moved to help Morrison subdue Weatherby. But Weatherby was a trained soldier who knew how to fight, and he managed to break free from Morrison's grip. Weatherby rolled across the floor and grabbed his rifle before the other officers could stop him. Weatherby pointed the rifle at Morrison and shouted, "Stay back or I'll shoot!" Weatherby's face was red with anger and desperation. He backed toward the window as if he was planning to try to escape that way. Morrison remained calm despite having a rifle pointed at him. He knew that the rifle contained only blank ammunition, so Weatherby could not actually hurt anyone with it. But Morrison did not want to reveal this information to Weatherby yet, because it might make him even more desperate. Morrison spoke to Weatherby in a steady voice. "Put down the weapon, Thomas. There's no way out of this situation. You're surrounded, and your associates are being arrested right now. Surrender peacefully and we can work this out." Weatherby responded by pulling the trigger of his rifle. There was a loud bang and a flash of light, but no bullet came out of the gun. Weatherby looked shocked and confused. He pulled the trigger again with the same result. Morrison took advantage of Weatherby's confusion to explain the situation. Your ammunition was replaced with blanks during last night's maintenance. You can't hurt anyone with that weapon. Now put it down and surrender." Weatherby realized that he had no options left. His weapon was useless, he was outnumbered, and there was no escape route. After a few seconds of hesitation, he threw the rifle on the floor and raised his hands in surrender. Chen and Rodriguez immediately moved to handcuff Weatherby and search him for other weapons. They found a small knife and a cell phone, both of which they confiscated as evidence. Morrison received confirmation that the other arrests had also been successful. Marcus Volkov had been arrested at his hotel without incident. The computers at the internet cafe had been seized, along with evidence of the communication system Weatherby had been using to contact his handlers. As Weatherby was being prepared for transport to a secure detention facility, Morrison asked him about the planned attack on the state dinner. Morrison wanted to make sure that there were no other members of the spy ring who had not been identified. Weatherby refused to answer any questions about his activities or his associates. He seemed to understand that he was facing serious criminal charges and that anything he said could be used as evidence against him. But Morrison was not worried about Weatherby's silence. The surveillance evidence, the false identity documents, and the intercepted communications provided plenty of proof of Weatherby's crimes. Morrison was confident that Weatherby would be convicted and sent to prison for a long time. More importantly, the arrest had been completed without anyone being injured and without Weatherby being able to destroy evidence or warn other operatives, who might be working in different locations. Morrison knew that the investigation would continue for several more days, as intelligence agencies analyzed all the evidence and made sure that they had identified all members of the spy ring. But the immediate threat to the palace and the royal family had been eliminated. Morrison felt a deep sense of relief and satisfaction as he watched Weatherby being taken away by government agents. The operation had been successful, and the palace was safe again. But Morrison also felt grateful to Prince Alexander, whose careful observations and proper use of security protocols had made this success possible. Without Alexander's warning, Weatherby might have been able to carry out his planned attack during the state dinner. Morrison looked forward to briefing the royal family on the successful conclusion of the operation and to commending Prince Alexander for his crucial role in protecting the palace and everyone in it. The days following Thomas Weatherby's arrest were busy with investigation activities and security reviews. Captain Morrison worked closely with government intelligence agencies to analyze all the evidence that had been collected and to make sure that the spy ring had been completely dismantled. The investigation revealed that Weatherby and Marcus Volkov had been planning a complex operation during the state dinner. Their plan involved infiltrating the palace during the dinner, taking photographs of classified security procedures, and potentially kidnapping one of the visiting dignitaries to use as leverage in negotiations with the government. The spy ring had been gathering intelligence about the palace for several months before Weatherby was hired as a guard. They had studied the palace's security systems, staff schedules, and the routines of the royal family. Weatherby's position as a guard had given them access to detailed information that would have made their operation much more likely to succeed. Government analysts determined that if the operation had been carried out successfully, it could have created a serious international incident and put the lives of many people at risk. The visiting king and queen, as well as the local royal family and palace staff, could all have been in danger. Morrison was impressed by the sophistication of the spy ring's planning. They had created false identities, forged employment documents, and established secure communication systems. They had also conducted detailed surveillance of the palace and had developed backup plans in case their primary operation failed. But despite all their planning and resources, the spy ring had been defeated by the careful observations of a 12-year-old prince who had noticed that something was not quite right about one of the guards. On Friday afternoon, 3 days after Weatherby's arrest, King Frederick called a private meeting with Prince Alexander and Captain Morrison. The meeting took place in the king's private study, a comfortable room filled with books and family photographs. King Frederick began the meeting by thanking Captain Morrison for his professional handling of the security threat. The king praised Morrison's quick response to Alexander's warning signal and his careful planning of the arrest operation. Then King Frederick turned to his son. "Alexander," the king said, Captain Morrison has told me about your role in discovering this threat. To our family and our country, I want you to know how proud I am of you." Alexander sat quietly and listened as his father continued. "You used the observation skills that Professor Hartwell taught you, and you used the security protocols that I taught you. Most importantly, you stayed calm and followed proper procedures even when you suspected that we were all in danger." King Frederick explained to Alexander that his actions had prevented what could have been a very serious attack. "The intelligence agencies have told us that Weatherby and his associates were planning something that could have hurt many people and caused problems between our country and our neighbors," the king said. "But because you noticed that Weatherby was behaving suspiciously, and because you reported your concerns through the proper channels, we were able to stop them before they could carry out their plans." Captain Morrison added his own praise for Alexander's performance. "Your observations were extremely accurate," Morrison told the prince. "Everything you noticed about Weatherby turned out to be significant. His surveillance patterns, his interest in building plans, his unusual questions about palace operations. All of these things were evidence that he was gathering intelligence for his spy ring." Morrison also praised Alexander's use of the hand signal system. "You communicated the threat to me in exactly the right way," Morrison said. "The signal was clear and immediate, but it was also private, and did not alert Weatherby to the fact that he was being investigated. This allowed us to gather evidence and plan his arrest without putting anyone in danger." King Frederick then made a formal announcement to Alexander. "Because of your service to our family and our country, I am awarding you the Order of the Silver Eagle, which is given to people who have shown exceptional courage and wisdom in protecting others." The Order of the Silver Eagle was a rare honor that was usually given to adults who had performed outstanding service in the military or in government. Alexander would be the youngest person ever to receive this award. King Frederick also announced that there would be changes to Alexander's security training. "You have shown that you understand the importance of security and that you can be trusted with serious responsibilities," the king said. "From now on, you will receive more advanced training in observation and analysis. You will also be included in some security briefings so that you can better understand how to protect our family and our country." Alexander felt honored by his father's recognition, but he also felt somewhat overwhelmed by the seriousness of what had happened. He had started watching Thomas Whitfield simply because something seemed strange about the guard's behavior. Alexander had not expected that his observations would lead to the discovery of a major espionage operation. "I was just doing what Professor Hartwell and you taught me," Alexander told his father. "I watched carefully and I reported what I saw through the proper channels. I didn't know it would turn out to be so important." King Frederick smiled at his son's modest response. "That is exactly the right attitude," the king said. "The best service to your country often comes from doing your duty carefully and conscientiously, even when you don't know how important your actions might be." Professor Hartwell, who had been invited to attend the meeting, also praised Alexander's performance. "You applied your lessons perfectly," the professor said. "You observed carefully, you took detailed notes, you asked good questions, and you reported your findings to the appropriate authority. These are the skills that will make you a good leader when you are older." The professor also announced that Alexander's security training would be expanded to include more advanced topics. Alexander would learn about intelligence analysis, threat assessment, and crisis management. These skills would help him protect himself and others as he took on more responsibilities in the royal family. Captain Morrison concluded the meeting by presenting Alexander with a special commendation from the Palace Security Department. The commendation recognized Alexander as an honorary member of the security team and thanked him for his outstanding vigilance and exemplary use of security protocols in the protection of the royal family and the palace. After the meeting, Alexander returned to his room and sat by his bedroom window, looking out at the east gate where Thomas Weatherby had stood just a week earlier. The gate was now staffed by a different guard, an older man named Peterson who had worked at the palace for 15 years. Alexander thought about everything that had happened and everything he had learned. He realized that his observations and his training had truly made a difference. By paying attention to details and following proper procedures, he had helped protect his family and prevent a serious attack. Alexander also realized that this experience had taught him important lessons about responsibility and leadership. As a prince, he would always have duties to protect and serve others. Sometimes these duties would involve dramatic actions, but more often they would involve careful attention to everyday details and situations. Alexander picked up his notebook and wrote a final entry about the Thomas Weatherby case. He wrote down the lessons he had learned and his thoughts about how to be a better observer and protector in the future. As Alexander finished writing, he felt proud of what he had accomplished, but he also felt humble about the responsibility that came with his position. He understood now that being a prince meant more than just living in a palace and having formal ceremonies. It meant being constantly alert to threats against his family and his country, and being ready to take action when necessary. Alexander looked forward to continuing his security training and to taking on more responsibilities as he grew older. He knew that there would probably be other threats and other challenges in the future, but he also knew that he had the skills and the support he needed to meet those challenges successfully. The Thomas Weatherby case was over, but Alexander's education in leadership and service was just beginning.